Well, greetings everyone, and welcome to the monthly webinar series hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, also known as the CASC, which is based at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm Imtiaz Rangwala, Climate Science Lead at CASC, and I'm co-hosting this webinar with Heather Yokin, who is our Stakeholder Engagement Lead. We bring you these monthly webinars to facilitate a discussion of science, research, and best practices related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate, with a focus on the North Central US that encompasses the Missouri and the Upper Colorado River basins. Before I introduce our speaker for today, a quick word on housekeeping. We are recording this webinar, and you can find all our webinar recordings on our website. During the webinar, all participants will be muted, but you will have the ability to unmute during the Q&A period at the end. We, however, greatly encourage you to submit your questions and comments through the chat box anytime during the webinar. And now I'm very, very pleased to introduce Dr. Gregor Schuurman, our speaker for today. Gregor is an ecologist with the National Park Service's Climate Change Response Program, which is headquartered in Fort Collins, Colorado. He works with parks and partners to understand and adapt to a wide range of climate change impacts. His work specifically focuses on helping incorporate future climate projections into management and planning, producing and synthesizing management relevant science, and developing climate adaptation tools and concepts. Gregor received his PhD from the University of Washington's Zoology Department and his MS from University of Minnesota's Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior. Gregor will be discussing the RAD framework with us today, and he also sent me some useful links on that subject, which I'll share in the chat shortly. And Gregor has also been kind enough to take a little work break during his vacation to be with us today. So thanks again so much, Gregor, and please take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Imtiaz, and thanks to you and to CASC for the opportunity to speak to everybody today about this topic. CASC has actually had a lot of involvement in the development of the RAD framework, at least early on. And so in a way, this is a bit of a full circle conversation here that I'm excited to have, and kind of plan to take a more relaxed approach than I have in some recent RAD webinars. We've got a little more time, and I'm hoping we can get into a nice Q&A at the end. As this nice long title of mine states, we think the RAD framework is useful because it helps clarify the challenge that modern natural resource managers face. And in doing so, it supports strategic forward-looking action, and that's basically the case I'm going to try and make here.
Gregor, can I?
Yeah.
We don't see your video. I mean, it's your choice to turn it on. But
no, I'd happily do that. Let me figure that out, Imtiaz.
No worries. Just if you can,
yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay, it's all right. We hear you well. We see your slides well. So no worries.
Yeah, I don't know why that is because it says it's on here. But anyway.
Okay.
I apologize for that.
Not at all.
We can fix that later. Okay. Anyway, you'll just have this disembodied voice talking to you. And so we'll just focus on the images. A couple of prefaces. The first one is that we're focused here on natural resources, but there's broad relevance because we're talking about transforming natural systems. And within those systems, we have embedded significant infrastructure and facilities, of course, cultural resources, and in many cases embedded within those landscapes is our own senses of ourselves and our connections to the world. This is also a heavy topic, and I don't mean to be light about it with the meme here, but this is a heavy topic, and it's important to remember because I'm going to be fairly dispassionate and technical about it, but we all have some strong emotions associated with managing systems that are starting to look less and less like we used to recognize them. Stepping into RAD, I just want to emphasize that a framework like this, which we'll describe shortly, doesn't come out of nowhere. It sits within a progression of work, and the work is of helping parks and partners, in our case, understand and respond to climate change. And so I'll kind of illustrate a little bit of that context quickly. Our program began over a decade ago and was an early adopter of scenario planning. And after a few years of development, we produced a guide in 2013. And we have a page called the Scenario Showcase. There's a link on the bottom right, an NPS Scenario Showcase, where we highlight these individual lessons, these individual efforts that we've done. Many of them funded by the NC CASC, with NC CASC and other partners being important participants. So I'm just going to kind of show you a few of these things. This one came up about a week ago, a really neat scenario planning guide that is oriented around research at White Sands. And then one I want to bore into just a little bit more at Big Bend in the Chisos Mountains developed area. This is work by my CCRP colleagues, Dave Lawrence and Amber Runyon. Just a quick illustration of scenario planning. The idea here is they were doing a major water supply development project, multi-million-dollar effort. And what they wanted to do was stress test the decision here against the far ends of the way climate could play out by mid-century. Lots of detail I'm skipping over here, but the essence is that in picking two contrasting projections, the warm wet in the top left and the hot dry in the bottom right, we end up with two very contrasting but plausible climate futures. One sees a 24% increase in precip, but a lot of volatility, and the other one sees a 31% decrease. Both of which lead to collectively no improvement in the frequency at which a major spring supplying the water in this area for both facilities, operations, and wildlife. Basically, under the warm, wet scenario, you get no change. And under the hot, dry, you get a more than doubling of these sort of water shortage events. And I won't get into the details except to say that this kind of work basically informed a multi-million-dollar decision here. And that's what we're trying to do, is sharpen scenario planning so that it can really be the basis for some consequential decisions. At the same time, our program and many other federal agencies were partnering under the leadership of the National Wildlife Foundation in developing climate smart conservation. Again, after years of work and careful thought, out comes a guide in 2014 with these important overarching principles and the need to manage for change and not just for persistence, and to reconsider goals and actions. Okay, so these were high-level guides, and here I'm linking climate smart conservation with the international version of this, the IUCN Adapting to Climate Change, both of which echo this mantra of manage for change and not just for persistence. However, both of them are very frank that in the year 2014, 2016, the details were yet to be determined. And the shortcut here is that RAD comes along as one of those details, how to actually mainstream these principles into adaptation. And ultimately, earlier this year, all three of these approaches were unified in an NPS document called Planning for a Changing Climate. And you can see two principles there below, one of them about scenarios and one of them more of a climate smart principle. So all of this is to emphasize that the kind of tools that we share in a webinar like this come out of years and years of careful work in the field with a lot of partners. So let's look a little more closely at the RAD framework. What is it? Well, it's very simple. It's a three-part framework of manager choice in response to strong human-driven ecological trajectories and either ongoing or prospective transformation in an ecosystem that one is managing. And we argue that there are three distinct choices that a manager can make. One can resist this trajectory and work to maintain or restore ecosystem processes, function, or structure based on historical or some idea of natural. One can choose not to intervene and simply accept the change that's happening, or one can instead intervene with a motivation of not resisting the change, but trying to direct it, at least to avoid, let's say, the sort of least desirable potential ecological outcomes. All of these choices constitute adaptation if they're done strategically. Although we sometimes slip and we call it the resist, adapt, direct framework, it's the resist, accept, direct framework. This framework is useful in our experience in supporting natural resource decision-making because not only does it focus on manager action, as I said, but it also sort of incorporates manager intent in the same three simple words. What is it you're actually doing when you apply a particular action or activity in a natural system? Like I said before, it encompasses all possible options. It's very simple. It's neutral in that it does not elevate one choice over the other. The argument being that context is everything here, and the right choice is about incorporating context and then being forward-looking and strategic. It works across time and space, and I'm not going to get into that in detail except to allude to some work near the end that really addresses those kind of dimensions of RAD application. And it's complementary towards other approaches. And I'll highlight one example later on of how it's complementary with adaptive management. So where does this framework come from? That question's been asked lately, and it's not something we've talked about a lot. You know, officially you could say it comes from the year 2020, but that's not really true. There's a history here. And on the NPS NC CASC side in particular, we headed out on a multi-year, ultimately a multi-year project to advance climate change adaptation in the Northern Great Plains in a series of projects that the NC CASC funded. And I show that on the map on the left from central North Dakota to southwestern South Dakota and northwestern Wyoming. And the challenge there again is we're in a room, in a workshop, and we're trying to advance climate smart adaptation with a scenario basis. How do we do that? And so that's how the story looked there. And some of us were uncomfortable with resilience as a framing for how to do forward-looking adaptation that really confronts and reckons with the kinds of changes we see. We thought we needed more. At the same time, we recognized that there was a deeper history of thinking here led by David Cole, other federal scientists and academic partners from sort of 2008 to 2010, which really took a close look at ideas like naturalness and historical condition as reference for managing natural systems and came to the same conclusion that I'm articulating here, that sort of our existing and historical approaches have some real worrisome limits given the kinds of changes that we're seeing or anticipating. And so this thinking proposed a framework called the Resist Accept Guide Framework, a three-part manager framework oriented around manager choice. So very similar and obviously a preceding version of this. We, at the time that we started our work in the Northern Great Plains, did something a little bit different. We did resist, accommodate, direct. And our emphasis here was on direct. We thought guide wasn't strong enough and that we needed to admit within the spectrum of what a manager might do some fairly intensive intervention. Not saying all the time, of course, but that this had to be within the spectrum of possibilities. And I'll point out also that we did think about this as a spectrum at the time. Our thinking has sort of deepened since then. So about a year or two later, in response to the same challenge, a federal group called the Federal Navigating Ecological Transformation Working Group began to form around this same set of challenges. And I show here the different agencies that contributed to this and some of the key early text and our talking points. I'm not going to read it. It's basically the same theme I've been driving. But at the bottom there is a recognition that we needed some kind of coherence across agencies as we started to try to develop or standardize some new thinking. A lot of this was kicked off by a symposium in the 2017 National Adaptation Forum led by Bruce Stein of the National Wildlife Federation. And it was pitched as when resistance is futile. So it's almost like you resist until you can do no more, and then what do you do? Our RAD thinking has suggested we might have retitled that and wrapped our arms around the broader context and said that, you know, resist, accept, direct options have to be thought about within a recognition of it's not at the end of the line, it's early that you do this thinking. I want to just point out here that this effort has pulled in most of a couple of dozen folks. You can see the diversity of organizations there who've been working on this on the federal side since early 2018. And one of our major products was the Resist Accept Direct report that came out as an NPS report late in 2020. You can see the link down there. At almost the same time, just about a year later, two professional societies that you see there in the middle of the slide polled their members and concluded, based on a survey, that ecosystem transformation was also an important concern of theirs. And they stood up a group named the Ecosystem Transformation Working Group that was composed of members of those two societies. And you can see here as well a diversity of contributing affiliations. Over the past few years, we've linked up, we've shared members, joined forces, and so we essentially have most of 3 or 4 dozen folks working in concert and in communication on this challenge. So there've been a lot of heads put together and focused on all of this. And that's yielded an expanding body of literature. Laura Thompson led a paper that came out in Fisheries last year. Of course, the RAD report I just mentioned. And just today, Abby Lynch of the National CASC has led a paper that came out that just kind of continues the RAD conversation forward in terms of the detail of applying the framework. There's also a USGS RAD webpage that's a really good clearinghouse for recordings of webinars like this one and a lot of the literature I've referenced. And so you can pull that link out of the chat. Now let me get to the juice of this. Why is this framework needed? And essentially a deeper kind of exploration of what it is. The short answer here is that the RAD framework is needed to help managers make unavoidable choices strategically. And this is because modern human-driven ecological trajectories bring new choices and questions. So this is a diagram I worked up. It's actually inspired by a paper by Harris et al. But the idea is to illustrate how things were and then how things are today. So in the past, experienced weather here represented by a temperature curve operated within some bounds. You had a red dot you could call a mean that was fairly useful. And this range, this blue bar that I call my stationarity bar here, basically is those bounds. And related terms are historical range of variability used fairly abundantly in agency work. And we're talking about a climate envelope here. Now below, what we can see is ecological condition can be fairly responsive to these changes, this variability, like the blue line, or it can be more resistant and less responsive, like the purple line. Ecosystems vary. But what we're experiencing nowadays is non-stationarity. That same curve is on an incline. That red line is no longer a mean, it's a trend. And as you can see over time, experienced weather is departing the historical range of variability. First is an extreme event there in the orange circle, which is just a harbinger really of where the trend is headed, because shortly thereafterwards we get a heat wave. And then not long afterwards, we get climate departure when minimum conditions begin to exceed historical maximum conditions. What I was supposed to show and isn't coming out for some reason is ecological responses. But the essence is over time, this non-stationarity is beginning to drive ecological responses outside of precedent. Examples of this right now are things like, here's an article from this morning, maybe 1 billion marine animals died in that heat dome experience of ours along the Canadian coast, as well as, of course, hundreds of human beings. So that's transformation. In terms of drought, we're seeing conversations now in the media that are recognizing ideas of departure, or at least conditions being outside of historical, so non-stationarity. In my own backyard, and this is a paper written by Phil Higuera, NC CASC member, consortium member, and others. We had this going on, right? We had the largest and second largest fires ever to burn in Colorado, burning at the same time near each other. And many of us were downwind of this for months, and it was awful. And what we understand is that this kind of burning is without precedent for millennia. So this is a popular media article, and there's the scientific paper that came out. That was a nice pair. And a graph that Higuera and colleagues presented is this graph that I'm not going to go deeply into. I just want to draw your attention to the red line, which is subalpine forest wildfire activity. And I've superimposed here a blue stationarity bar to again show us what departure from stationarity looks and how dramatic this graph is suggesting it is in terms of subalpine forest wildfire activity. So there's that graph I meant to show earlier. And what it shows is that as we have these trends, ultimately ecological condition undergoes change as well. It can either be smooth or abrupt, depending on the nature of the system, but ultimately it's heading into sort of a big enough change that the term ecological transformation seems to be useful. And if you do a Web of Science examination of the frequency of its use, it's going up dramatically, which is not surprising. And we've offered a bit of an operational definition underneath here at the bottom of the slide, but lots of other folks have done a lot of thinking about this. And I thought I would just delve into a case study here to help us understand what this looks like on the ground and how managers see it. So we're going here to Kenai National Wildlife Refuge in southern Alaska, and we're drawing here on the help of two FedNet members, Don Magnus and John Morton, both from the Fish and Wildlife Society. John recently retired, but these two have worked at Kenai National Wildlife Refuge collectively for decades. And they understand that this refuge has been historically kind of on the climatic boundary of climate space for boreal forest, temperate forest, or savanna and grassland. And that over recent decades, it's been moving away from the boreal forest climate space and kind of walking the line between temperate forest and grassland. And so when this system receives larger disturbances than it has in the past from bark beetles, from drought, and from forest fire, their Lutz spruce forest, when it burns down, doesn't come back. And instead they get a monotypic grassland, Calamagrostis. And so Dawn and John and colleagues think about potential responses to what they understand to be a human-driven change to their landscape. So the first question is a natural one. Can this be resisted or reversed? And they say to themselves and to other people asking this, that we need to think about scale. We need to think about the nature of climate change and recognize that there's always significant ecological uncertainty. So here's this landscape seen from space over time. You can see the opening up, the transformation happening. We recognize the directionality of climate change. So second question, what if we accept this trajectory? Where are things headed? Right, illustrated here graphically. Is a depauperate grassland the endpoint, or what happens next? And then there's a third question, is it possible to direct this trajectory even if it can't be reversed or resisted? And there's a recognition that early is probably a better time to try and do some of this stuff than late. And part of this is because there's a lot of thinking going on about options and even some actions being taken by private neighbors. And so things are in motion. And there's a conversation here that honestly needs some structure and guidance for a bunch of obvious reasons. And so that's where we think RAD can be helpful. So what does RAD Framework application look like? We did a webinar a couple of weeks ago, and I provide the link down below for NCTC. And this one was really great because it highlighted field studies, 3 different case studies from across the country. And so I'll just hype this and encourage anybody who really wants to hear other voices and voices from close to the ground talk about this to go and have a look at these really excellent case studies. I'm going to just show us some images from around the country to give us a sense of these diverse and complementary actions. So here we are at Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge on the Maryland coast. This is a unit that's very focused on adapting to sea level rise. And in one part of the refuge, they are applying thin layer application of sediment in a strategic resistance activity, helping this marsh keep up with sea level rise. In the same management unit, further inland, they're actively facilitating the inland migration of salt marsh to avoid a net loss of salt marsh extent as this transformation happens. So you see the complementary of resisting and directing there. In Sequoia and Kings Canyon in the southern Sierras of California, firefighter Luis Magana stands guard here in sort of the ultimate example of intensive strategic resistance. He's protecting one important tree. Obviously, we can't scale this up, but this can be strategic and justified. It's all about context. In the Rocky Mountains, in the aftermath of the perfect storm, so to speak, the managers there are observing some systems because there may not be much else one can do, especially large-scale change. And there's some real curiosity. There are good reasons to observe before acting. At the same time, limber pine is a species that's had a lot of focus, conservation, restoration focus. And so the park has the means and is interested in resisting some of the recent impacts and doing some replanting. In Acadia National Park, they face a situation where they're at the boundary between a boreal and a temperate northern hardwoods biome. And their worry is that as the boreal elements are impacted by drought and other stressors, what's going to replace them is not a range expansion of northern hardwoods from the south, but instead a thicket of Eurasian non-natives, a rambunctious garden that stakeholders and managers are not really interested in accepting. So here the effort is to understand what more southerly species might do well, and also to screen for those that might be problematic and ultimately get ready to do some directing. Another example of this, Glacier National Park in Montana. Here, John McCubbins is releasing the first juvenile bull trout above a major waterfall, a natural barrier in that park, moving these fish to higher elevations to conserve their thermal niche and also at the same time to protect them from some non-native species. So this is an example of directing, fairly small scale within the same management unit, but a pretty clear directing of change in that system. Fire Island National Seashore in the New York area in response to Hurricane Sandy made a different decision than in the past in recognition that sea levels are higher. Maybe it's time to let coastal processes play out. So here they had a breach in a barrier island, and instead of engineering closure, they allowed these dynamics to play out. And finally, a great example of directing, a long-standing example from the Grand Portage Chippewa of northern Minnesota, who saw, based on very focused monitoring, a decline in brook trout in an important fishery. And they engaged in managed relocation to conduct an ecological replacement with yellow perch and walleye. So good, strong, decade-old example of directing ecological transformation. So what next with RAD? Our major challenge is scaling up. What I've just shown you are some bright spots, some early adopters, some leaders in the field, creative thinkers, and people just doing their job. But this isn't what adaptation looks like everywhere, far from it. There are a lot of folks who need a lot of help. So scaling up is important. And so FedNet member Scott Covington recently brought RAD into the Fish and Wildlife Service refuge system climate change page as an effort to try to mainstream and scale up. We, as I mentioned earlier, have a guide on the far right, Planning for a Changing Climate, which seeks to unify scenario planning, climate smart, and the RAD framework. And at the same time, as I mentioned, we've got sort of a stream of literature coming out, including the paper that's come out today in Frontiers, as well as a special issue and review that I'll just briefly kind of walk us through. An intro paper that I led on that's sort of a version of this talk, you could say, basically just kind of getting us into it. We used a nautical analogy shown on the left to sort of suggest options a sailboat might have trying to get back to port when strong winds are pushing elsewhere. One can use a motor, right? Use new tools with some compromises and resist. One can accept and just see where the wind is going to blow you, or you can set that sail and harness that energy, but go to a preferred new situation. I mentioned earlier we had initially thought about RAD as a spectrum. Instead, this paper kind of takes a deeper look, and it works with graphs like the one on the right and suggests that RA&D can be mapped onto at least two spectrum here, resultant deviation from historical conditions in your system and the intensity of intervention you'd like to engage in. And I think we'd argue that there really isn't much room in the bottom left anymore, except in, let's say, a pure climate change refugium. Paper number 2, led by Dawn Magnus of Kenai, just got accepted this week and just takes a deeper look into applying RAD. And here's some illustrations on the right of thinking about portfolio designs, sequencing decisions in time, understanding very clearly what the trajectories are in the first place, and recognizing that there are multiple future multiple future states, ecological states or trajectories to be chosen from. Paper 3 is about RAD and adaptive management. And this paper, led by Abby Lynch of National CASC, basically posits that there's a third loop in adaptive management that needs to be built in to basically conduct adaptive management in the context of transforming systems. Paper number 4, led by Katie Clifford of the USGS in Fort Collins, delves into the social aspects of this. And not just the sort of obvious, hey, there's a social context, which is very important, of course, but also the details of how managers make decisions, right? Which is very important when we think about training and mainstreaming RAD and the rest of what RAD is attached to, and recognizing that there are both internal and external constraints on how managers decide. And I'll just say in general, what's been incredibly important in the RAD work that we've all done is the early engagement and participation of social scientists, so that this was a social and natural project from the beginning. Final paper, led by Shelley Crosby, presents a science agenda to support natural resource decisions in this context. The argument is, if we take a standard adaptation process like this 7-ish step cycle here, when we have the prospect of ecological transformation on our minds, we tend to ask some specific questions, and those are illustrated in red here. And I'll just kind of delve into one to kind of walk us into this, and that's question 3. What are the plausible ecological futures? So here's an example of 2 plausible divergent climate futures, kind of along the lines of the Big Bend example I showed at the beginning of the presentation. And each of those climatic futures has more than one plausible ecological future. Now, a lot of us who've been involved in climate change, participatory scenario planning, have got pretty good on the climate divergence, but it's really translating those into really plausible ecological futures and recognizing more than one potential future for a given set of climatic conditions is a new frontier. And so there's a place where we think calling that out and being very clear about sort of RAD motivated science questions is important so that we can foster the kind of science that frees managers up to make these decisions. Beyond all that, there are other challenges of scaling up, which just involves compiling and comparing case studies, really exploring and applying the social dimensions. You've heard me acknowledge it here, but not go into any detail. The science needs I just referred to, really transmitting those back up the chain, the science chain, sustaining a federal collaboration, because we believe that the feds have unique challenges and reasons to talk to each other, while at the same time recognizing that we're part of an expanding community of practice involving very diverse organizations internationally, as well as NGOs, academics, state agencies, private actors, municipalities actually have been very receptive to RAD. So diversity of folks who are interested in this framework and using it to help them clarify and guide natural resource decisions they're making. I'll pause now, or actually stop and say thank you. And I don't know why my camera isn't working. I really apologize for that. And if anybody has any ideas, I'll take them. But
I'm sorry, Gregor, but your camera was working from the very beginning. I probably, misspoke. I didn't see you early on, but then I could see you.
Well, then we're great.
Oh, great. Well, it worked out perfectly. And thanks so much again for this excellent presentation. There was a lot of information in there, and you're really good with the time as well. I'll just open it up to folks. At this point, you should be able to unmute yourself and also turn on your video if you want. And then just go ahead and ask Gregor questions. If you have any comments also, please share them.
We just had one question pop up in the chat. Robert, do you want to ask your question? Do you want to just unmute and ask your question, or would you like me to?
Yeah, sure,
Okay.
sure. I wasn't sure we'd be able to be unmuted here since there's such a crowd. First of all, great series and a great presentation. Thank you so much. A question I had for you is, at least within the Department of the Interior, with the new Native American Secretary of the Interior, there's a lot of emphasis on consideration of tribal, traditional ecological knowledge. And I was just wondering to what extent these kinds of considerations beyond the typical Western science approach have been contemplated in developing RAD, or maybe considered into the future.
Yeah, I'll say 2 things. One is, among the actors involved in some RAD application, particularly the case studies that I referred to in the NCTC webinar of a couple of weeks ago, are some important Indigenous partners. The Acadia example, which is one of the 3 case studies, has basically Indigenous staff as well as Indigenous partners who are involved in the kinds of management decisions that they're invoking RAD to help clarify and guide. The other example, good, strong example from last week, was the East Jemez landscape in and around Bandelier National Monument in northern New Mexico. And that's a place where the Pueblos have been really important and influential partners in helping everybody recognize and work with transformation and sort of get out of the resilience rut, as one of the leaders of that effort talked about it. So those are efforts where sort of organically among the diverse partners are some Indigenous actors who seemingly find the approach useful. that's sort of the bottom-up answer. The top-down answer is a different one, which is FedNet's involved right now in some conversations to expand beyond the standard land and water management agencies, the small set that I showed, and sort of broaden that sort of feds and friends conversation. One of the papers I alluded to in the 5-paper set actually devotes 500 words to a big box that kind of makes the point you were making, Robert, that a lot of what we're talking about here, at least the way we're framing it and the way we're approaching it based on who we serve, is that we are encountering, or managers we work with are encountering challenges to the modern natural resource management approach. However, as we point out in the paper, that's not the only model for stewarding ecological systems. And so we think there's a need and opportunity for some sort of formal kind of conversation about diverse indigenous perspectives and whether RAD is useful and how that is. And so on the one hand, we're trying to cultivate that. On the other hand, I'll say on a call like this, that door is wide open and we're interested in that conversation and supporting it and doing what we can.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gregor. Appreciate that.
Yep.
Other questions?
If we're waiting for stuff to come in, I have one thought that I didn't hit that might be useful.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Want me to? RAD and resilience. I've knocked it a couple of times, but that doesn't mean I don't think it's a useful concept, especially when we're very clear and we were talking about ecological resilience. And given we're talking about ecological systems, that certainly applies. There are a number of schemes, and obviously we put RAD together because we think ours is, suits us better. There are a number of schemes that use resilience as one of the choices. And we found that problematic because we thought that's not a manager choice, that's a system trait characteristic. And the other thing we thought about is if we're directing change, we're probably interested in having that change be fairly resilient. So we found the resilience applies both to resisting change. You may want to enhance the ecological resilience of your system today, but it may also be that after you direct a change, there's some steps you can take to enhance the resilience of that new ecological condition. So we find resilience is applicable, but it sort of applies to more than one of our buckets.
Yeah, great point. Resilience term was always tricky for me to use.
Hey, Gregor, this is Brendan Moynihan. I'm thinking back to one of your late slides that had it was a big, beautiful Venn diagram that had decision space in the center, and a couple of those circles, consideration side, dealt with culture. One was internal culture, and then the other was kind of the institutional context. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that piece, perhaps specifically about the Park Service and the reactions you're getting to the actual application of this way of thinking for directed change.
Great question, Brendan, and nice to hear from you. This is good, and this is almost one, Brendan, that if you want to jump in on my answer as an NPSer and kind of flesh that out and give your own impressions, that would be useful for me as well. I'm picking up Katie et al.'s slide here, so I'm playing social scientist, so I'm going to be careful there. Let me stick within the NPS then and just say that in my own experience, I encounter, and I think any of us who work with, many managers encounter real diversity. Not only in manager inclination, but in context. So the first thing I want to say is, just because we're focused here on strong trajectories and the prospect of ecological change doesn't mean the sky's falling everywhere, although scenario thinking tells us we can be surprised at how quickly events happen. But not everywhere is supposed to be throwing out everything they knew before and taking a new approach. And we argue that RAD isn't that anyway. It's complementary, it's clarifying. But nevertheless, the rate at which you need to expand your thinking depends on your context, but the rate at which you're inclined to do so depends on your constraints. And so here, this diagram shows us that there are external constraints, right? There's the scientific uncertainty that we're trying to fight, we're trying to reduce. There's the institutional context. That's about a lot of this communication of RAD and planning for a changing climate. Social feasibility is always important. And then there's the internal stuff, right? The management culture, the worldviews, the understanding of the ecological system within that manager's mind. And, you know, worldviews in particular are very diverse. We have folks in parks. Heck, I'd probably lump myself in this, who come out of a 1970s idea of conservation, right? A few motivated people get together and do great things. And a lot of the history of our parks is exactly that. So that's real, but that perspective often has a hard time with the idea of embracing non-stationarity, right? The idea is we've got this park, we're going to keep what was always here, that's our job. And if we don't do that, we've failed. And non-stationarity sort of encourages us to recognize that we may be trying to go about this, you know, in an MPS context, conserving our biodiversity heritage. We may need to go about it in recognition that things are in motion, and we're probably more likely to be successful that way. That may require embracing declines of certain populations in certain states, and at the same time, arrivals of those species elsewhere. I think I'm falling into the weeds here just a little bit, but the point is you see great diversity among managers. And a lot of this is about their worldviews and management culture, and often perceptions of constraints that aren't quite there. And I'll end with this, that when we have conversations with folks who are our policy gurus in the NPS, what we hear is policy is actually fairly flexible. It doesn't mean there aren't some real constraints somewhere that we have to deal with, but policy is fairly flexible, and there's actually a decent amount of latitude for a manager to make arguments, especially in a non-stationary context where the idea of, well, let's just get a photograph from 1880 and make it like that, just it doesn't work anymore. I'll pause there. I think I've gone on long enough, but Brendan, if you want to add anything or refine the question or give your own impression, I'd invite you to do that.
No, that's great, Gregor. I really appreciate that thoughtfulness. You know, it just occurs to me that the part of the challenge that we deal with, whether it's Park Service or any other agency or resource manager, is that the time scale of decision making and comfort for a decision maker at a particular unit is much shorter than the time frame for decision given technical uncertainty and ecological process. And so it seems like it gets very easy for a given decision maker who may be at a particular unit just for a handful of years to kick the can down the road and pass the buck. And then we end up with non-action. That's perhaps a pessimistic view, but I really appreciate your reflection on that. Thank you.
Yeah, and your view is not unrealistic, because what that manager would tell you is, yeah, I know I'm supposed to be forward thinking and strategic, but I've got, you know, a backed up, you know, bunch of people trying to get in the park and the toilet's overflowing, right? There are other problems going on at the same time, the tyranny of the urgent. And that's where it's not fair to ask a manager to do everything. We need our systems, we need our agency culture to help. And that's where guidance and engagement and, you know, if this is a super tanker we're trying to adjust course on, it's a big effort, and everybody's kind of in the same system. So mainstreaming requires pushing in more than one front, is what I'd say. And managers, I think, deserve a lot of credit and also a big break here. They need support, and that's what the rest of us are here to do.
Say, Gregor, this is Bob Kurska from Fish and Wildlife Service again. This is a fantastic question and great discussion. And my question relates to that as coming from another bureau within Department of the Interior. Could you speculate on what you think it's going to take? You know, as you say, managers have a lot of latitude, you know, to make things happen at the local level, and that's their job. At the same time, at the agency head level, there are policies and restrictions and laws and interpretations, and that ship that you're talking about can take a really long time to you know, sort of tweak its course to get to the point that we're talking about here. Could you speculate, you know, maybe based on your experience and working with lots of other agencies, what you think it's going to take to change that agency culture at the top, because folks can do things at the lower levels, but as you say, it also takes that culture change at the top, and without that, it's just sort of a hit or miss situation.
Yeah, I mean, here's where I would want to tag out, honestly, because I'm not the social scientist. So I would ask the three authors of this paper, Katie Clifford, Amanda Cravens, and Corey Knapp, to speak to that. And that's, you know, that's a paper that's part of our five paper bundle that's really tries to wrestle with this and talk about it. And I'll tell you, the experience we had in FedNet is some of us ecologists recognize the importance of these social aspects. But we're not trained in it. It's not our field. That's why we collaborate. And so we would use words like values to mean much more than values, you know, just sort of a little bit of a blunt axe compared with the precision and the depth of thinking that folks who really think about this can bring to us. So, you know, this is a case where I would say, come to the next RAD, and actually let me hype it. We've got plans for what we're calling a RAD rendezvous. Sometime in the fall, late fall, we don't know when, but the idea is to be much longer form than just this hour and to really delve into these other aspects. And that's a place where I think I just want to make a note and come back to this because I'm not a pro in changing agency culture at the top. I'm just learning some of the language from my colleagues in this, but it's a big topic and it's something very much on our mind.
Great, thank you.
So we have 3 questions submitted on the chat, and I'll go through them first before we take more. So Gregor, maybe a little more succinct with your answers.
Sure, I'll try.
Okay, first one from Rita Reiser, which is, are there any examples of the RAD approach being applied at a species level, such as for developing an SSA, recovery plan, and other planning documents? The Fish and Wildlife Service does not have the luxury of working at ecosystem levels.
Okay, let me give a quick answer to that. I'm involved with Chris Hoving of Michigan DNR, working with the Corner blue butterfly, which is a listed species, been listed since the early 90s. Sensitive to climate change, has a broad distribution. And we are basically in the mid to late stages of developing a detailed report that applies RAD to understanding the challenges that species faces and developing the answers. And that's, again, in the interest of brevity, what I'll say is, A, that's a product coming out you may hear about in a half year. And B, if you have a particular interest and you want to chat with me more about that, then just connect with me through MTOS and let's talk further. And I would say that to anybody who's interested in RAD and single species, the short answer is we find it useful, and we've got a draft product that I can share with folks that kind of shows how that works.
Great, thanks. Sorry to restrict you to your short answers. Next one is from Kara Painter Green. And Kara, please feel free to add to your question, but the question is like, how do we deal with these changes in the cultural landscape context? I think you probably addressed some of that earlier. But Kara, do you want to add to that question further?
Just kind of in that discussion you were having with Brendan, it's like one of the biggest struggles I think for our parks is that they have these cultural landscapes that do lock them into a very narrow window of how things are supposed to look, and how do we really have those discussions when that cultural landscape is the dominant factor driving how the park is supposed to function. Think Knife River.
Yeah, or Devil's Tower was where I was going to go.
Yeah.
And I'll just quickly recognize Kara as one of those folks in the field who collaborated with us on some of this Northern Great Plains work. And quick illustration from Devil's Tower, which was one of those series, where the whole landscape is a cultural landscape, right? Sacred to more than a dozen tribes who have ongoing relationships and ceremonies happening right now. And in that case, the availability of meadows as ceremonial areas is important, has been to the park for a long time. And what scenario planning work showed us is that there are likely to be some changes in the ratios of ponderosa pine to meadows and some shifts in those boundaries. And it depends on which climate feature you're looking at, which direction those changes might go. What a park can do now is shift, sometimes fairly subtly, the way it does its monitoring and assessment to be more sensitive to those changes, and have also done preparatory thinking so that the park is ready with some options depending on which way the ecological trajectory seems to be going. So that doesn't mean any big change on the ground today, but it means, again, becoming more sensitive and more able to do early detection of changes, and to have thought in advance about management actions one might take depending on which way the trajectory goes.
Next question is from Tom Olive. Gregor, climate change process science is evolving much faster than managers' understanding of that process. In fact, most managers don't yet have a full understanding of the basic climate smart cycle. How do we help managers catch up with these new ideas?
You know, I think you call Tom Olive and you ask him what he thinks. And this is, you know, these are all my collaborators and my colleagues raising the sort of challenges we all talk about at the end of the day. This is difficult stuff. I alluded earlier to this being a super tanker. The NPS has more than 420 different management units. I don't know. We give webinars, we write papers, we talk to the folks at the top of the chain. Sometimes the media is a decent echo chamber. We highlight managers in the field who are doing these things so that others, we can say, you can do this too, or maybe not this, but some version of it that works in your context, peer to peer. You know, I can sort of give us a laundry list, but this is our challenge. This is where we're at. And I'm cognizant of a gap between some fairly sophisticated thinking here that I think is necessary even to deal with simple problems, and that the reality of many managers, again, sort of not well contacted by any of this, and that's its own effort. We could do a whole webinar on that, and we probably should.
Other questions? Maybe I'll insert one here, Gregor. And I'm thinking about the temporal aspect of the RAD framework, where, you know, it's always in the works, right? We make some decisions in the present context, but things may look different 5 years or 10 years from now. And so this continuity of, you know, having that mindset at play. I guess you have the diagram there.
Yeah, so this would be Dawn Magnus from the Fish and Wildlife Service leading this one. This paper got accepted in the last few days, so we're really excited about it. And I'll just sort of say, stay tuned, and in the end, read this paper, or maybe Dawn can do a webinar that just really gets into this stuff. There's a lot here. And that's why, you know, when I give this sort of introductory to RAD kind of presentation, there's a bit of frustration because what I'm emphasizing is the simplicity and the broad applicability and blah, blah, blah. But what's behind all of this is actually a lot of thinking about the challenge of transforming systems. And RAD is just sort of an organizing tool, right? An organizing framing or structure. But really, the bigger thing FedNet and these other groups have been doing is thinking about the reality of transforming systems and what that means. And part of that, as you see here on this slide, is a recognition that these are trajectories. This isn't one stable state to another. These are systems on the move because of non-stationarity. And so you kind of see these illustrations showing us different management pathways, different triggers when certain activities might be taken depending on how the trajectory plays out. Some dotted and dashed lines, perhaps indicating different levels of certainty. I guess the broadest perspective, or the broad answer, is simply we recognize that a series of actions will take place over time, that climate change and the other stressors driving trajectories and transformation aren't going away anytime soon. And there's also recognition, not shown as much here. I guess the upper diagram sort of shows it, but that this same portfolio would be applied differently in different places, often in a complementary way.
Great, thanks, Gregor.
Mm-hmm.
We have one question from Tyler Hecker. Does the RAD framework offer anything regarding how much management intensity we ought to exert, or how much deviation from historical condition we ought to accept?
No, it doesn't. It's supposed to be agnostic. That depends on your mission, your management unit. It depends on what the rights holders and stakeholders think. That's the context. But what we can do is tell you that, for instance, here, if you're not inclined to intervene, then you're likely to be accepting in many systems and over time some significant deviation from the way things were. And if that's okay, then great. So yeah, this diagram has been kind of useful to kind of talk about that. But the point is, it's just a structure. It's not a decision maker. The decision maker uses the structure. And you know, the case studies from the NCTC webinar for a couple of weeks ago, I think are pretty good at least testifying to the utility of RAD in that way, and not feeling like it's a challenge that you get this clarity, you get a tool that helps you communicate. Now you use that clarity and you go and communicate, and then you all decide what to do.
Yeah. Perhaps we have time for one more question. Maybe a burning question somewhere, a comment. Gregor, perhaps you have one last thought.
Let me try. I think the last thing I'll say, this is useful, is that precision is useful here. I showed some illustrations like Blackwater where they're using both resist and direct, focusing on the same system fundamentally, saltwater marsh. And so being very precise, this sort of what to what kind of issue, being as precise as you can about the resource or the trajectory you're thinking about is really useful, because you may very well resist one thing in one place and direct something or accept elsewhere. And if you just say, well, we're managing the world here within these boundaries, then it's all just scrambled. And so the way to use the clarity of RAD is to apply it as precisely as possible to your problem and define that problem precisely.
Right. That was a wonderful last thought. Thanks again, Gregor, so much. You can go back to enjoying your vacation at this point. And thank you all. Yeah. And thank you all for joining. And we hope you'll join us again for our webinar next month and down the road. So take care. Stay well.
Thank you.